Welcome back to the Bloom Sustainable Materials Podcast. I'm John, here with Ryan in the Bloom Room. Today we're talking about environmental restoration. Okay, so last episode we talked about the FDRA releasing their EPM guide. And in the EPM guide, they talk about regenerative materials. Let me just read to you what that means. Regenerative materials regenerate the environment through carbon capture, water cleaning, and or environmental restoration. And I know algae gets a bad rap sometimes. It causes a lot of environmental problems. So how in the heck does algae restore the environment?
Yeah, so algae is commonly villainized because of the dead zones, these fish kills, the overall negative impacts that algae blooms can have on the environment. But when you look at the process of photosynthesis that algae is conducting, algae can grow 10 to 100 times faster than plants and trees. It does this by absorbing carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus at incredibly high rates, and it's converting that pollution into a biomass. And it's really the visible response to a overabundance of an invisible pollution. So you can't really see carbon dioxide. You can't see nitrogen. You can't see the phosphorus, but you can see the blooms that are growing from it.
So it's being framed pretty much.
Turns out it also puts bullseye on it because now people see the algae blooms. They smell the bad odors. They may have issues with drinking water quality. Some species of algae can actually produce toxins. So all these things combined make for great headlines in the press.
Yeah, nobody is saying on the news, oh, look how great algae is. It's always negative.
It's a major problem out there, but it's one that, if reframed in a new way, is a huge opportunity to actually restore the environment if we can harvest the algae. So through harvesting the biomass, we are capturing, exporting, and storing those nutrients in the biomass for use in other applications.
So obviously that method, it's visually appealing to somebody because you can drastically see the difference of a before and after picture of harvesting. It's here's the bloom, we harvest it and it's gone. Explain why that's not necessarily the best option for harvesting algae.
The efficiency of doing that at scale, it's not as efficient. It's more expensive to go out and try to play whack-a-mole with algae blooms because the nutrients are there. These systems will, they have water, nutrients continuing to flow through them. So really, the best case scenario is to go upstream to tackle the pollution at the source in combination with mitigating and reducing algae blooms at the places that they're most negatively impacting the local communities.
Yeah, so harvesting in like a huge lake, yeah, it's impactful for maybe a day, but it can come back that next day.
And so the companies and the governments that are doing this, these aren't over the weekend projects. These are long-standing, permanent infrastructure trying to, systematically and I would say gradually reducing the nutrient loading in that lake through harvesting of the biomass. And the only way that works is if you're cutting off the supply of nutrients. If one side of the lake you're polluting into it, and the other side of the lake you're harvesting algae out, that will never end. That'll keep happening. So you've got to tackle the source of the pollution, and you've got to work with the lake's ecosystem and start to export those nutrients to return balance back to the water chemistry.
So both of these harvesting methods, they're both cleaning water. The objective is still being completed.
Yes, so whether you're tackling and cleaning the water at the utility scale or you're doing it at the lake, you're taking the algae out of the water, you're putting oxygen back in the water, you're pulling the nutrients out. Whether you're doing that at the utility scale or you're doing that at the lake, the end result's the same. You have clean water, you have cleaner air.
Cleaner air. How does algae clean the air?
So part of photosynthesis, it's not just the nitrogen and the phosphorus. Carbon is a critical element of the equation. So normally, algae blooms will pull in CO2 from the atmosphere. That's from diffusion of air into the water body, into the lake. But we also find that the carbon that's being captured by the algae that's being stored in the biomass. And so when we go and use that algae for some other purpose, the carbon that's in that biomass is a renewable source. It's being cycled from the environment. But there's this additional benefit that provides a major positive impact on climate change. And that is when the algae is not harvested under normal circumstances, the algae blooms tend to rot. They biodegrade, they die, and as they break down, they release not just CO2, but more specifically, they release methane as a gas that comes off of the rotting biomass. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 is. And so the overall impact on climate change is much more impactful when comparing methane release from the rotting biomass.
So it's a CO2 sequestration story, but it's also a methane prevention story.
Exactly. The methane prevention is a huge element of the story that's not always talked about. In fact, the CO2 emissions, and as a result, these methane emissions from eutrophication. So eutrophication is this fancy word for this water pollution issue we're discussing. That is somewhere between 18 to 33% of all the greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels.
That's incredible.
So just the rotting of the algae around the world is over a quarter of the entire greenhouse gas emissions of the fossil fuel industry. And so when we look at trying to improve climate change and how do we mitigate climate change, carbon capture is going to be one of these critical tools, and algae seems to be one of the most promising natural ways to capture that carbon and put it to good use.
So since algae can capture carbon, is there any possibility that algae could be considered as a carbon credit?
Yes, that is in the motions right now. In fact, it was just approved through the U.S. government to allow algae utilization as a approved carbon capturing technique, which means it is eligible for carbon credits. And so that's a great step forward. And the value of those carbon credits are only going to increase over time.
And since Bloom provides quantifiable metrics in the form of like a stock certificate, basically, we're basically handing them here. Here's your carbon credit. Save it for future use.
That's correct. Yeah, we can prove and quantify through our GRS audited supply chain how much of the CO2 is being captured through the use of the Bloom materials in their products.
So it turns out algae isn't a villain after all. Yes, it can grow fast. Yes, it causes a lot of problems, but it's responding to a widespread, invisible problem in the water.
And that's the pollution.
And it's not just a local problem, it's a global problem.
It is, but yet so is the solution. You see, this algae harvesting technology, it can be deployed in any country, in any community to help mitigate climate change and provide environmental restoration.
That's incredible. Thank you guys for watching this episode. We'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or if you have an interesting topic that you'd like us to talk about, leave it in the comments below. If you like content like this, please consider subscribing. We'll see you next time in the Bloom Room.